Hi, friends. Today is going to be a little bit different. It's just me. Morgan is in the throes of moving with three children and a full-time job, and her husband is in grad school. So, yeah, she's a little busy at the moment. But I wanted to get on and offer some thoughts on a comment that we got a while back. A few months ago, we released an episode with our friend Kyla Gillespie, who was releasing her new book. And in that episode, Kyla shared just a little bit of her story of living as a trans man for 6 years and then encountering Jesus and detransitioning. And so we got a comment on that episode that our producer sent along to me for some thoughts. And that comment said this: there are many trans people who have no conviction to change. We worship God in spirit, not with body parts. And I just want to talk about that today, not because it's an extreme comment, but because it's actually a really thoughtful one. And it surfaces a tension that I think a lot of us are trying to navigate. You know, if you've heard me teach before, you know that I talk a lot about what I like to call the messy middle space. That space where both conviction and compassion can exist at the same time. This is a space that Jesus forged and staunchly upheld, a space where compassion does not erode conviction, but also conviction does not erode compassion. Because if we lose conviction, we lose truth. And if we lose compassion, we lose the heart of God. Jesus never asked us to choose between those. So we have to hold them in tension together. And that's what I like to call that messy middle space. So I want to start here. I first want to honor this commenter because I can feel something underneath that statement. I can feel kind of a protectiveness, a desire to advocate, maybe even a sense that people, especially trans individuals, have been misunderstood or mistreated. And honestly, that's not wrong. Many people in the LGBTQ community have experienced real hurt, often at the hands of Christians. And so if that's part of what's behind this comment, I see that. I respect it. And I want to clearly say that's not us. I respect your right to live how you choose. I respect your process of conviction, and I respect you as a person. You are worthy. You are loved. You are not an issue to be solved. And I also want to say, I agree with part of this. There are many people in the LGBTQ community and just the world at large who have no conviction to change. That's true. We're not here to convince anyone to change. We exist to help those who already believe what we believe, not to convince those that don't. So I think we need to also be really careful not to assume that conviction should be immediate or that if something we can manufacture in someone else. If someone genuinely loves God and is seeking Him, I trust that God is capable of making things clear in His timing, not in mine. Because when I look at scripture and even just at a foundational level of how God created us, I don't see a separation between our spirit and our body like that. I actually see something that's much more integrated. And I want to gently push back on that part of this comment because I actually don't think that scripture gives us permission to separate body and spirit like that. One of the clearest places we see this is in Romans 12:1, where Paul says, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. So biblically speaking, worship is not just internal. It's not just spirit. It is embodied. And we see this reinforced again in 1 Corinthians 6, where Paul says, you are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. So there's this consistent thread in scripture that our bodies are not spiritually irrelevant. They're actually included in our obedience and in our worship. So I would say we are absolutely called to worship God in spirit, but not apart from the body. And when we go back to Genesis 1:26 and 27, we see something really important. It says, God created mankind in His own image. Male and female, He created them. So our embodied reality, our sexed bodies, are not random or detachable from who we are. It's actually tied in some ways to how we bear the image of God. And then in Genesis 2, when Eve is created, the language used for the parts of Adam's body that was used to form Eve, the Hebrew word is often translated as rib, but the 40 plus times it's used at other points in the Bible, it never means rib. It usually means the side of a sacred structure or building like the temple or the tabernacle. So God's use of this language in the creation of our bodies points to something deeper. There's a sense in which the human body is treated with sacred intentionality. In fact, the Hebrew word used in Psalm 139, when it tells us that our bodies are fearfully and wonderfully made, that word literally means to quake in reverent awe, to marvel. So biblically, the body is not just a shell for the real you. It is part of how God designed you to exist and reflect Him in the world. And this is where I think the statement really breaks down theologically, because scripture does not present us as a soul that just happens to have a body, but more like an embodied person, body and soul together. We see this in how scripture speaks. Paul often uses language like your body and yourself interchangeably when he's calling people to holiness. We even see this in the resurrection. Jesus is raised in a body, not as a disembodied spirit. And 1 John 3:2 says we're going to be like him when we're resurrected. So even in our future glorified state, there is continuity of embodied existence, which means the body is not something we graduate out of spiritually. It's something that remains part of who we are. So when I hear this statement, we worship God in spirit, not with body parts, I think I understand what's underneath that. I can appreciate the pain that might be driving that belief. Probably something like, I love God and I want to worship Him, but living in this body feels so difficult, so confusing, so incongruent for me, that the only way I know how to reconcile that is to separate my spiritual life from my embodied experience. And I just want to say, I have so much compassion for that. There is real grief there, real tension, real difficulty, especially for those experiencing gender dysphoria. And even as I hold to this conviction that scripture does not separate our worship from our bodies, I also want to acknowledge how heavy that truth can feel for someone whose lived experience in their body is not one of ease or alignment. And if I, as a fallen human, can feel compassion for that, even while disagreeing theologically, how much more does God, our perfect God, feel compassion for us? His compassion is not in conflict with his standards. He holds both perfectly. And because of that, I don't think the answer is always a quick surface level fix it. Like just change everything, get into alignment with God's ways, right? Detransition immediately. I think the invitation here is a lot deeper than that. The invitation is to continue seeking God, His presence, His kingdom, His righteousness, and to trust that over time, He is faithful to bring clarity. Not just to what we believe, but to how we live, how we align, how we walk with Him, body and soul. Because at the end of the day, the goal is not behavioral modification. God makes that really clear in the Bible. The goal is intimacy with God. And I really believe that as intimacy with Him deepens, alignment follows. But I also believe the reverse can be true. That as we step into alignment with God's ways, we begin to understand Him more clearly, and intimacy has more room to grow. The limits that God gives us are not meant to restrict our joy. They're meant to protect and deepen it. They're not arbitrary rules designed to prove our allegiance to a distant and dogmatic deity. They are given for our good by a God who knows what leads to living life to the full. And even when we don't fully understand His ways, and we won't because we are the created, not the creator, we can still trust that God's ways are not against us. They are meant to lead us into life, into joy, not away from it. So that's what I would say to the commenter and to anyone who resonates with that perspective. But for those of you listening who share my convictions, who are trying to live this out faithfully in your own life and relationships, I want to say this to you too. We have to be really careful here. Because even when we're holding to what we believe is true, there's a subtle shift that can happen in us where our focus on truth becomes so strong that the way we carry that truth starts to lose the heart of God. Not because the truth is wrong, but because our posture begins to drift. And this is where we have to stay really anchored because Jesus never separated truth from love. He didn't just speak truth, he embodied it in the way he moved toward people, in the way he engaged them, in the way he held both clarity and compassion at the same time. And if we're going to represent him well in this conversation, we have to be just as mindful of how we carry that truth. So if you're listening and trying to navigate this in real life with your kids, with your friends, with your community, I just offer a few practical things. Create safety. Listen more than you speak. Get curious before you respond and ask questions respectfully. Ask open-ended questions respectfully. And if you hold a conviction, be honest about it, but don't weaponize it. So here's where I land. I do believe that God created us as embodied people, body and spirit, and that both matter in how we live for him. And I also believe that every person, no matter how they identify, no matter where they land in what they believe or how they live, every person is deeply loved by God and worthy of dignity, respect, and relationship. I don't think we have to choose between truth and love. In fact, I think choosing one or the other is where we've gone wrong in the past because Jesus never did that. He was full of grace and truth. And I really believe that the way we carry both, the way we hold conviction and compassion together may just be one of the most powerful testimonies we have in this current cultural moment. Because at the end of the day, people won't remember all of our arguments, but they will remember whether they felt seen, whether they felt safe, and whether they experienced even a glimpse of the heart of God through us. All right, friends, thanks for sitting with me in the messy middle today as we wrestle with the tension behind this comment, one that reflects a loud and influential voice in our culture right now. My hope is that this equips you, especially as we move into Pride Month, to navigate this experience in our modern world with both clarity and compassion, truth and grace. We'll see you next time.